Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 61 in the series. Welcome! I'm coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, where I'm a professor at the university there. I teach a lot of science fiction and speculative fiction and all kinds of good stuff. I am enjoying a kind of quiet Sunday, and I thought it's a great time to podcast in the morning. I'm trying a new light setup. Those of you who know, have been watching the cast for a while, know that we moved recently and our house happens to have a lot of awnings over the windows, which means there's less natural light. So in the last couple episodes, you know, I've been trying to find some good light. So I've been outside, I've been in the yarn room, and now I'm in a different room in the house. So we'll see how this all turns out. This is a podcast mostly about knitting and garment modification and DIY, a little bit of spinning as well whenever I can get around to it. And today I've got a nice packed show full of lots of sweaters and sweater modifications. I have a finished object, which is my Rumo sweater. We'll talk about that. I also have some cool info on modifying sweaters in case you put in a stripe you don't like or something like that. We'll talk about that today. And SweetGeorgia Ambassadorship, which some of you might have heard the announcement. I talk about that. My Panda by Susan B. Anderson has a sweater, so that's gonna happen. And I thought I'd give you a little day in the life of sheep at the end. So if you guys are interested in what it's like for us to have Kathy's sheep here pasturing for the summer, I have a few little video entries to put at the end for those of you who are interested in farm life. And then finally we've got the our Modification KAL for the year is coming up on the end, and so I did a drawing for a giveaway for somebody who put up a finished object photo in the feeds over there for garments and accessories, and we have a winner, so that will be also part of this cast. I kind of feel like this one should be called Rumo and Everything After. A little bit of a Counting Crows reference there. For those of you who like the Counting Crows, it was one of the first CDs I ever bought back in the 90s. Number one was actually Gin Blossoms, and then after that it was a lot of Jackson Browne. So now you know some of my music preferences from the 90s. Okay, so why don't we get started with, let's get started with Rumo, because Rumo is finished and it is also modified sweaters, so I'll talk about the modifications for that one before I get into some other general modifications for sweaters. If you need to find me, by the way, you can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, and that is here on YouTube, on Ravelry, on Instagram, and on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com, and that's where I put all the show notes. So if you're ever looking for a pattern or a link to a shop or a name or any of that kind of stuff, you'll find it over on the blog. Okay. So Rumo. Rumo is by Alice Caetano, and Alice Caetano really, I've always been very impressed with her patterns. They're often kind of like, they're from a different angle oftentimes, or they do something really funky with color and texture. She's kind of like I don't know, I feel like she's like the graphic artist of textiles or something like that. So I really like what she does. And one of the reasons I wanted to knit this sweater is because it's knit in a different direction. A little bit like Bristol Ivy's knitting out of the box, kind of like outside the box. Just this idea that you can really knit things in directions that aren't always traditional. It's not always top down or bottom up. You can go from the side, you can go any kind of direction. So if you're interested in those kinds of patterns, Alice Caetano is somebody to look at, and definitely Bristol Ivy. So this one is knit, and I've talked to you a little bit about this before. It's knit from like sideways, right? So you start, I'm trying to remember now, because this has been a while for me, because I knit, I think like 2 or 3 or 4 test sample knit sweaters in between. This was my personal sweater that I've been working on and kind of like picking up when I could. But basically you knit this sideways. And I brought in, I saved this because when I was first knitting the sweater, you know, I'm a big proponent of gauge swatching and figuring out what your work should look like so that you know your row gauge and your stitch gauge. But sometimes those things don't work out. And when I actually just had this experience. I'm working on the Windfall sweater, and I did a gauge swatch, and I went up a needle size because I needed to, and then I started knitting, and the sweater turned into this huge, massive sweater. So even I've knit like, I don't know, upwards of 20 some sweaters now. I knit gauge swatches. Sometimes they don't tell you everything you need to know anyway, but I still am a proponent of them. So when I started this sweater, I knit this. This was the first bit of the sweater. So you start here on this edge, which is this guy over here on the side. And you're basically knitting this part of the sweater. So you're knitting from, I think I'm gonna put the sleeve up here out of the way. You're knitting from, this is where you're casting on, right here under the arm, and you're knitting kind of backwards and you're doing your armhole shaping at the same time. But what you can see here is that when I cast on for this, following my gauge swatch and the pattern, what I didn't like was the length. And this is a good, I think 2 inches shorter. And I'm not sure you can see that, so I'm gonna try to pull the mannequin up here a little bit. This little swatch that I did, which is actually not a swatch, it was the beginning of the sweater, was a good 2 inches shorter than I ended up going with for the length of this sweater. So let me see if I can line this up for you a little better now. So that's the armhole, that's the top. And I think you can see now that there's about 2 inches of extra fabric on the finished one, not on the sample I have here. And so I decided after I knit this, obviously, to make this longer. And the cool thing about this sweater, modification-wise, is that because you're knitting sideways, to modify the length of this sweater, all you do is cast on more stitches to your initial cast on. You just cast on the number of stitches that your stitch gauge tells you would give you an extra inch or 2, and then you just knit sideways and follow the pattern, because I wasn't modifying the armhole depth at all. I was just modifying this length for the sweater, which is it's a kind of an interesting, one of the reasons I like this sweater is it really pushes you to think about sweater knitting and the directions that you're knitting in new directions. And this particular sweater, it's actually more important to think about your row gauge than your stitch gauge, because your stitch gauge is going to give you, length for cast-ons and things like that. But your row gauge is what's going to determine the width of your fabric and how far you need to knit before you get to the center of your back, which is one of the panels. And then you knit the other panel the other way and you join them together with this seam here, which is kind of like a quasi-visible seam, and I think that's on purpose to kind of highlight the variegations in the yarn. I also think that this pattern is cool because you knit it in these different directions, this variegated yarn ends up showing off its kind of variegation much more. So you can see it on the front and on the back. You end up with these really interesting kind of vertical stripes. And by the way, this sweater, as I said, it's knit in all kinds of different directions. So you work the back in that kind of simple fashion, which is this kind of paneling. But then you start picking up stitches and using short rows to create this kind of sweeping shape. And I think you can see that. It has this nice kind of like curve to the bottom. And then you're adding this collar up here with some nice shaping to the neck, which now you can't see because the mannequin is too high. So I'll bring her down. So you can see the shaping to the neck here. Right? And then the other modification I did to this, and many of you saw this, and it was one of my technique videos that I posted, is that I decided to not knit the sleeves as set-in sleeves. I didn't knit them flat and I didn't set them in. And I've talked about that a lot on this podcast. There are sweaters where it really is a good idea to set in your sleeves, depending on what kind of fiber or yarn you're using. And I actually got a great email from Sarah this week asking about alternatives for wool for a sweater, someone who is sensitive to wool or allergic to wool, and she was trying to knit a sweater out of a different material. And so we had a conversation about all the different kinds of things you have to consider. And moving from a set-in sleeve to what I did, which is a top-down sleeve cap, you have to think about the material that you're using, and you have to think about the drape and how it's going to sit, and if it has enough structure on the shoulders, because that's where all the weight of the sweater is these seams up here, and then your shoulder cap and your sleeve. So I felt pretty confident with this sweater that it would be okay to go with the sleeve cap, and that's what I decided to do. And there's a whole technique video up about how I do that. But very basically, I pick up all the stitches around the armhole and work short rows until I get a cap on the sleeve. And then I just simply knit down as opposed to knitting up or in the flat, and then trying to set in a sleeve. I'm not against set-in sleeves. I think they serve an awesome purpose, and I think as a knitter it's great if you can learn how to do them, because it's a good thing to know how to do. You know, you gotta pin it, you gotta do your probably mattress stitching usually to make sure that it all comes out nice and even without any bumps or puckers. So it's a great skill to have, and I would highly recommend it. But on a lot of sweaters you can do this kind of modified top-down shoulder cap thing, and I kind of like it. I just think it makes knitting a little bit simpler, and I just love short rows. So anytime I have a chance to do some extra short rows, I will do them. I'm gonna raise her up so that you can see the cuffs. One of the things I tried to do with this yarn, and this is the yarn that's called for in the pattern, it's this Rumo, Rumo's the sweater. It's this Beroya yarn, and I've showed this on here before. It's a beautiful singles yarn that's variegated and very woolly. It is, I think it's, I know it's 100% wool, but it's Portuguese wool. It's a Portuguese wool. But one of the things I wanted to do is to kind of play around a little bit with the color and the variegation to my advantage. So with the sleeves, once I got toward the bottom, I wanted to make sure that I had both of them looking kind of the same at the cuffs. So in the case of this sleeve, I broke the yarn at a certain point in this kind of, as we get closer through this lighter section, and picked up a portion of the yarn that was a little bit darker so that it would produce a similar sleeve bottom to the other sleeve. So that's my other last modification for this one. It's a really great layering piece. I think it'll be really useful for me. Like I said, I'm a professor, so I teach a lot. And I think it's gonna be a comfortable kind of warm layer in the winter for teaching. And it's really comfortable, easy to knit, really fast, nice kind of worsted weight yarn, and it gave me a chance to knit in all these different kinds of directions and think about different kinds of modifications. So it's a cool knit, I'd highly recommend it. It's Rumo by Alice Caetano. So let me do a quick mannequin switch because I want to talk about another kind of sweater modification that I did on the last sweater that I didn't talk about in the last episode. So here we go. Voila. So as some of you will recognize from episode 60, this is Song and Dance, and this is an LB hand knit sweater by Albina McLaughlin. I talked a lot about this sweater in the last episode, so I won't repeat myself there, but I will tell you something that I forgot to mention last time around, which is that when I was initially doing colors for this sweater, I was using this color as a kind of extra layer or an extra transition color. So I had two transition colors. I had the dark blue and the light blue. And this was something that Albina and I went back and forth on because she sent me the yarn for this sweater. It was intended to be a kind of sample for her. And when I put in that blue stripe, this is a top-down sweater, so the blue stripe happened here, and it was also down on the hem, and it was supposed to be on the cuffs as well. Once I put in that blue stripe and then finished the sweater off, I'll put a picture in here so you can see it, it just didn't sit right with me. And I was like, I don't know about this color, it's not working for me. Because you can see the rest of these colors have a kind of, they kind of fit in a color family of one kind or another. They complement each other, there's something about them that kind of works, I think, even if they are very bold and graphic. But this blue, it just wasn't working. So as you can imagine, I had already knit the entire body of this sweater, and that's 3 sections of color work, the yoke, the whole deal. And I was like, oh, how am I gonna do this? Because you have to imagine that this was, you know, this is like a stripe in the sweater. It's just sitting there like this. So what do? Well, I used my handy dandy technique of that I used for the adding length to a sweater video. Same technique. Before I did any more with the sleeves, because you can see that this color goes all the way around where the sleeves are, right? So before I did anything else with the sleeves, I picked up all of these stitches in this upper color. In this color work section, there's the lighter color that you see, the red, and then there's this green. It's a very dark green. And the colorwork section has a couple of rows of plain stockinette at the end. So I was able to pick up all the legs of each stitch going around. So I had the upper part of the sweater on one set of needles. And then down here in this light green, again, got a little bit of stockinette before the color work starts. I picked up all of these stitches, and then I unraveled this stripe. So if you're doing color work, you know that this stripe was a transition color, so at some point I added it in. So I found where I added it in and I started pulling it out. And I just, I pulled out this entire seam here and I pulled out this entire seam here, leaving me with 2 chunks of sweater. So I had this chunk of the sweater and I had this upper chunk of the sweater. And what I proceeded to do is pick up, these stitches were all sitting on my Addie's interchangeable needles. So I just picked them all up, used the band that they were on, started knitting, and knitted down with this color, the darker blue, which I was much happier with. And once I had knitted enough of the blue, the same number of rows that I had originally in the light blue, then I grafted, grafted these 2 sections together. So this seam here is actually Kitchenered, if you can believe it, right? All the way around without any puckering or anything. And I'll show you the back. All right here, you can barely see, because I haven't woven in all the ends, so you can barely see where this end is a little bit loose, and if I pull, you'll see that it comes together there a little bit, right there. So this entire section is Kitchenered. And yes, Kitchenering like a couple hundred stitches is definitely not something for the faint of heart. I would not recommend it. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend doing it twice, which is what I did. Because when I set the top part of the sweater on the bottom part of the sweater, I was paying attention to most things, but I didn't think to myself, oh my gosh, wait, there are short rows at the top that need to be centered. So by the time I finished, the bottom section was just, I should say the top section was just a little askew. It was off by about 20 or 30 stitches. And you could see, because here in this pattern, you can see that everything lines up, right, pretty nicely. But it was askew. It was turned just a little bit. And so I went through the whole procedure again, picked up all the stitches, picked up all these stitches, pulled unstitched this band here, and then turned everything, set it with some clothespins to make sure that it wasn't gonna turn again, and reattached it again with Kitchener. So yeah, there's that. That is true either insanity or dedication. I'm not sure which. But I just have learned that if it's gonna be a sweater that I wear and a sweater that I like and a sweater that I actually come back to over and over again, it has to be done in a way that I'm comfortable with. So it's too short, it needs some length. If it's got the wrong color, it needs the right color. If it's too tight, it needs to be, changed. Or like the one that I just completely frogged, if it's just too big, you gotta start over. And sometimes you can predict those things and fix them ahead of time, and sometimes you knit the entire body of the sweater trying something out and you realize it doesn't work, and so you have to take it out. So massive modifications happening around here, but I'm pretty happy with this sweater now. I think the colors all work together really well, and I'm super psyched about it. I think it's gonna be my ski sweater for the crazy teenage ski trip that I'm gonna probably be chaperoning again this year. Yeah, you can all start praying for me now. Okay, so that is Sweater Modification. That is Rumo. That is Song and Dance by LB Hinnitz. I'm gathering up all my yarn. And yeah, I think that's it for Modification and Sweaterland. Oh no, wait, I have one more sweater for you. It's the Panda sweater. So Panda got a sweater. Last week I showed you guys Panda. This is Susan B. Anderson's new little toy, and it has a little sweater. It's supposed to have a hood with it, but I didn't do the hood because this is for a little baby, my little grandchild, who's gonna be here in a couple of weeks. And I didn't put buttons on here, just like I didn't put buttons on the eyes because it's for a baby. We can add those things in later. And I figured the Panda probably won't even be wearing his sweater because he's going to a baby and just wants to be a cuddly toy. So I can add those modifications back in. It can have a hood later. This is a very simple knit. It's knit out of Barrett Wool Company yarn. I'll show you the sweater because I kind of want a sweater of this like this for myself. It's so adorably cute. It is knit with fingering weight yarn held together, and I love this yarn because it's so woolly. It's just, I think you can see it in the camera. It's just delightfully woolly. So I held 2 strands together to make this little jacket. It has a button band, it has armholes, it has all of the basics that you would need to learn for learning how to do top-down sweaters, because it's a top-down sweater. And so if you really wanted to experiment with sweaters and kind of learn the different ways that they can be built or designed, top down, bottom up, sideways, all those things, you could try making a bunch of miniature sweaters. And I'm very tempted to kind of make a bunch of them myself and send out the patterns into the world so that y'all could practice, or just at least see those modifications in some technique videos, because they're small and you can make them in about a day or less, probably a couple hours. So it's a very adorable little sweater, and that is the last sweater FO I have for the week. It does not fit me or anyone else that I know, except that it does fit Panda Bear. Yeah. Okay, onward to the next segment. The next segment is our rare, hard to find book series, and it also has included at times kind of local knitting books. And I think last week was kind of more of a local knitting book because it was a Faroese shawl book, which is harder to get if you're not aware that it's out there as a kind of specific, yarn-specific, cultural-specific kind of book. But it is available on Amazon and on Schoolhouse Press. So not all the books that we cover are totally unavailable or rare, hard to find. Some of them are just local or are in translation or something like that that might require a little bit of an extra step on your part to get a hold of them. So we've talked about Lithuanian knitting in here before. Because my friend Deanna is from Lithuania and she comes back to Urbana to visit occasionally, and we talk about knitting sometimes. So last time we talked about knitting style, and it led me to look into Lithuanian knitting, and we talked about the different styles of knitting. That was back on another episode. I'll try to put the title of the episode down here, the numbers, so you can go check it out if you want to. And it led me to this book by Donna Draconis and June Hall, which is readily available. This is Lithuanian Knitting, and it's a really great book full of culture, history, traditions, photographs of older equipment. It's a wonderful book. If you're interested at all in different traditions of knitting, which I am, this is definitely a book to get a hold of. But this isn't our book for the week. I'm just recommending it because this is a long trail. This is like Deanna, Lithuania to that book. And then Deanna came to visit last week, and she brought this, which is so cool. I've never had a book of knitting that's completely in Lithuanian, and as far as I can tell, the translation, and if anybody speaks Lithuanian and knows better than me, please help. But as far as I can tell, this translates to something like knitting hats with needles, something like that. And like I said, this book is available. You just have to kind of track down where to get it online. And I have a couple websites that I'll post in the show notes. It is by Vitalia Badziuenie. Ooh, that was really butchered. I'm very sorry. I tried to look up how to pronounce her name, but I could not find a good place. So here's her name. And here's the title, and I'll put all this in the show notes as promised. And Deanna asked if I wanted a copy, and I said, oh yeah, that would be wonderful. You know, next time you go, that would be great. And she said, oh no, take this one because my brother can send me another one. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So we've talked about Knitting Languages as a cool book that's still available, but a little bit hard to find. You have to kind of find it in different places like eBay or sometimes used on Amazon. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about that knitting language part. Even though it's in Lithuanian, the techniques that you need are all usually, well, a lot of them are in symbols in charts. So, and Deanna and I went through these, and I was like, I bet that's knit through together, and I bet that's, cable cross this way. And she's like, oh yeah. So if you're familiar with symbols, then for the most part, you could even just dive into this book because a lot of the patterns are set up in terms of charts. But the first part of this book is really great because it shows you tons of different hat patterns that are all knit up. And it's slightly different styling than some of the hats that I've seen even on Ravelry. It's just, those are total hoods. There are some really great caps in here that I think are just fabulous. This guy in particular if you're talking about different directions in knitting, this is the top of the hat. It's phenomenal, like what's going on in here. Lots of color work, lots of cables and texture. This is one that Deanna liked in particular. She pointed it out to me as one that she wanted to knit sometime soon. She's a pretty new knitter, so she's getting back into it after working on it as a child. And I just think these hats are really, really interesting and cool. And I was trying to look up the author on Ravelry, and I'm not sure, I haven't been able to verify that her patterns are up on Ravelry. If anyone else figures that out, let me know in the comments. That would be great. And I will, if I find her patterns on Ravelry, I will put them up in the show notes. So, full of patterns. I mean, I think there's like just a million different patterns. And here's, I started looking into Lithuanian wool. Here's a advertisement in the book for some Lithuanian wool. And Lithuanian wool, there's Knit Lit online is one place you can get, one source for Lithuanian wool. And a lot of the wool in Lithuania, as I learned from reading the Donna Draconis Lithuanian knitting book, tends to be wool that we might consider, some knitters might consider to be more scratchy, kind of like long wool with guard hairs, things like that. So it doesn't always make it into the online shops or Etsy or, places where people can get a hold of it if you're not living in Lithuania. And even in the Lithuanian knit shops, as I understand it, there's a lot of merino wool that's imported. So a lot of, if you're looking for Lithuanian wool, it might not be as easy to find if you want really like local, cool Lithuanian wool. But it's still something you can look into and try to find. And like I said, Knit Lit, I think it's Knit Lit, L-I-T, online has some availability for different Lithuanian wool. So that is your book for this episode. If you get a hold of it, or if any of you speak Lithuanian and know about this book, I would love to hear more about it in the comments, so please let us know and share your knowledge. And if you have other books like this from other knitting traditions that are in other languages, I would love to know about them, at least know titles, and maybe see the covers of them or have links to them where people can get them online. That would be awesome. Maybe I'll start up a Ravelry thread so that we can share some of the titles of these more local books, knitting books that are not always in English. All right. All right, a couple more segments left for today. The first is that, as some of you might have known if you listen into the SweetGeorgia podcast or a vlog that's aired weekly, or if you're on their Instagram, they've just announced the ambassadors that for this year for their company, and I'm so excited that they chose me to be one of their ambassadors. So I have a kind of longer history of following SweetGeorgia around. Not necessarily their yarns, but all of the teaching content that Felicia Lowe, who's the founder and creative director of SweetGeorgia, has put out over the years. And I found her actually through Rachel Smith of the Wool and Spinning podcast. They're both kind of based in Vancouver in Canada. And because Rachel has this spinning cast and because Felicia Lowe does a lot with spinning fibers and color, I found her class on Craftsy. And her class on Craftsy is amazing. It's how to spin these different colors, colored fiber, like variegated braids, all that kind of stuff. And I downloaded it to my iPad, and my husband and I watched it when we were out of internet range and had just a load of fun watching the episodes and learning all about color and how Felicia spins. And she's a really fun spinner to watch because she's very calm, cool, and collected. It's very like soothing to watch that Craftsy class. And I learned so much about color, and that was where I started learning about color theory and how to break down braids so that if you don't want to just spin a braid just straight, if you want to do something with the color, then Felicia Lowe's class is like a great place to start. She also put out a book. And then she has, in the last couple years, started up the School of SweetGeorgia. So I've been following her in terms of teaching, and maybe that's more obvious because, I'm a teacher myself and I love educational content, and I wish I could just take classes all the time, which I try to do, but mostly they're online like this. So my birthday treat to myself, I think it was 2 summers ago, was to purchase Felicia Lowe's special two color classes on her Sweet Georgia, School of Sweet Georgia platform. And I've been slowly watching them, and they're fascinating. And she does an amazing job of breaking down the different ways to dye yarn, not only like just basic steam baths or immersion dyeing, things like that. But I just watched, one of the classes was on self-striping yarn, and that was just incredible to see. And it gave me I mean, I already had respect for indie dyers who were doing self-striping yarn, but that was like, wow, I can see why that yarn costs more, why it's so cool, why very few people are willing to do it, because it's such a labor-intensive process. So anyway, I've been following Felicia Lowe around for a long time, and so to have her choose me as one of the ambassadors was really kind of cool. It's a little bit like one of your heroes saying, hey, you're cool too. I was like, all right, let's do this together. So I'm pretty excited for the year. I don't know exactly what it holds in store for me or the other ambassadors, but I do know that we're gonna have some yarn to play with. We should have some discount codes to share, and we get to just talk about School of Sweet Georgia and Sweet Georgia yarns, and have some fun with them. I happened to be on their website when she announced that they were doing their mystery bag sale for the year, and I've always thought about it, but I've never done it before, and I just happened to have clicked yes on one of the mystery bags. So I happen to have some beautiful, pretty recent Sweet Georgia yarns here. This one is in the color Deep Cove, and it is silk and cashmere, 55% silk and 45% cashmere, beautiful color. And this one is in the colorway Fauna, and it is 70% superwash merino and 20% cashmere, 10% silk. So some really beautiful bases that they're using. And as I said, Felicia's kind of the master of color. So I know they just put out their autumn palette this past week, and the autumn palette is looking really beautiful. It's kind of like a rich, kind of dusky kind of range from oranges to purples into like blues, you know, a lot of the colors that you would associate with fall and winter, and they're beautiful. So I'm looking forward to checking them out. But I'm really excited, as I said, about this educational content and having a chance to check out the school a little bit more and tell you guys a little bit more about that. So yeah, that's happening. It should be a fun year, and I will try to share as much as possible with you guys about what it is and what it's like. The other 9 ambassadors, I've linked them on Instagram, and I will link them in the show notes. You should check them out because they're cool people from all over the world doing some really interesting things with craft and photography and shared spaces and building community and knitting in different ways with different yarns and weaving and spinning. They're just a really cool crew of ladies, and I'm very proud to be among them for this venture. So it should be kind of fun. Okay. Last 2 segments, I'm gonna do the giveaway, and then I'll send you on to some farm life video if you're interested. So the giveaway is for someone who participated in the garment modification or accessory modification KAL that we had going on all year long. And I went into my stash to find something fun for the winner. And I found some Let Lopi yarn, which I knit this sweater out of, not these colors, but same kind of yarn, beautiful singles. And I thought, because I was talking about the Rumo sweater today and I had an extra skein, we would do some of the Beroya yarn. They're all singles and they're in beautiful colors, and this would be great for a colorwork project, or if you wanted to make a hat out of something or use these for whatever. It's a really great yarn. It's a really sturdy yarn. These guys are, and this is as well. And it's a beautiful variegated yarn, and I thought it's kind of a neutral that goes pretty nicely with these two. So that is the prize pack, all from my stash for you guys. So our winner is, who is our winner? Kathleen188 on Ravelry, and she knitted up the Weekender, which is, I believe, an Andrea Mowry pattern, and she changed the, she added colorwork to the top, she changed some of the ways that she was knitting the body of the sweater. She did some cool modifications. So congratulations, Kathleen188 on Ravelry. You will win this prize, and I will get it in the mail to you if you send me your contact info. And what I want to do now is just put a few screenshots up here for you guys to see some of the other awesome modifications that happen. I can't highlight everyone. I really wish I could. I did a couple last episode, and I want to do a couple this episode. If you want to go see them all, you just pop over into the Ravelry group, which is just Knitting the Stash. And it's the Garment Modification KAL or the Accessory Modification KAL, and you can check out all of the really cool projects that were entered. I think we had 26 entries, if I'm remembering right. That's a lot of modification happening out there in the world, and I'm very proud of you all. The projects look amazing. I'm putting up on the screen now some of the projects there was a skirt, there was a fern and feather sweater. There's just some beautiful work out there, and people really doing some modifications in terms of changing sweaters from the top down to the bottom up, adding color work, changing sizing, moving cables around so that they're more flattering, just really thinking about their garments and how they want them to fit and what they want them to look like on their bodies. So congratulations, all of you guys. You are doing the hard work of figuring out knitting. You're digging in, you're putting your needles in, you're cutting seams out, you're Kitchenering stuff back together. And I'm very proud of y'all for the work that you've done on modifications this year. So congratulations. We'll have to set up another KAL for next year. I don't know what it should be, so if you have ideas, let me know in the comments here, or send me a PM somewhere else, Ravelry or wherever. Yeah. Okay, for those of you who are interested, a little farm life segment. As you know, some of you know, we have sheep that we're pasturing for the summer. They're Kathy's sheep of Seven Sisters Farm, and we have about 7 of them out there. We thought we might have a few more, but we ended up with 7. And one of them is a wether, which is a male who's been castrated. So we do have 1 boy out there, and we have 6 young lady sheep. They're all a year or 2 old. And I just thought I'd show you a little video of like a day in the life. We go out and the morning, check their water. I try to keep the inner pasture cleaned up, make sure that we put some lime down if it's wet, or if they've been using parts of it as a bathroom that I know that they're gonna sleep on later, just to try to keep it nice and clean so we avoid things like fly strike. And we wanna keep their fleece as clean as possible because they're not jacketed right now. So just trying to keep the pasture kind of clean. Sometimes I'll bring a little handful of grain out to them, or corn, just to kind of get them to come over and, you know, have some fun with me and walk around with them in the pasture. But it's just, they're pretty low maintenance. They're really pretty kind of chill out there. It was funny, this last week we just adopted 2 barn cats, or kittens that will become barn cats. And so we've installed them in the barn in one of the stalls with chicken wire everywhere so they can run and play, but they're stuck in the barn for 2 or 3 weeks. That's kind of how you home them. And I can't have them inside because I'm terribly allergic to cats. So I've always wanted to have cats, and now we have a barn so the cats can be outside and I can go visit them and play with them out there, but I don't have to have them in the house and sneeze a lot. So we go out and feed the kittens and make sure they have fresh water and all that kind of stuff. But when we put the kittens in the barn, the sheep who usually sleep around the barn decided that like we had brought in a mountain lion. Like they were like, what are you guys doing? Don't you know there's a huge predator in the barn now? Because they could smell the cats. This is all I can figure. I was talking to Kathy about it. I was like, the sheep are acting kind of weird. She's like, they think you have a huge predator in the barn. So they stopped kind of sleeping right around the barn, and they started sleeping out more in the pasture, along the fences, in the garden. So every day I went out there for the first 3-4 days, it was like the sheep were in a different place than they normally are, and very few of them would come over to the barn, even when I would kind of come over with corn or something like that. So it's taken them a few days to get used to the kitty cats, but they did come into the barn the other day and they were fine with it. And now, just yesterday I saw them sleeping around the barn again. So they've decided that it's not a mountain lion, that it's like small kitten, it's okay. So we'll see how they get on in the next month or so once the kittens are released into the wild. The kittens, for any of you who are wondering, they're not traditional feral barn cats. They come from a Champaign Humane Society initiative, which is to place kind of semi-feral cats into situations where they might have a good long life and be cared for. So they're vaccinated, they're chipped, they're spayed and neutered, and they're pretty much safe to release into the outside world. So we're gonna take care of them as best we can. We'll feed them, get them home to the barn, water them, shelter them, and then we hope they catch some mice. and keep the pasture kind of like a fun, friendly place, and watch a lot of chicken TV because we have the chicks out there, and I'm guessing the cats will probably like to watch them. We'll see. So that's your day in the life of farm and sheep and kittens and all kinds of good stuff. And that is a wrap for the episode, I think. So thank you all for joining me, and I wish you happy knitting and spinning and modifying until I see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care.